I'm Owen from Bite Size Irish Gaelic. Welcome to episode 11, Iver a Hainjeg of the Bite Size Irish Gaelic podcast. Even if you're alone, learning to speak Irish outside of Ireland, do not despair. Rest assured that there are thousands like you across the globe, all interested in tapping into Ireland's native culture. For all about this podcast, go to www.bitesizeirishgaelic.com/podcast. Today I'll be covering some questions that came in from listeners and emailers to Bite Size Irish Gaelic over the last month or two. But onto iTunes reviews. Now, I don't know when Gearóid left this iTunes review because I hadn't been checking Luxembourg reviews page on iTunes, but here you go. Gearóid says, going from a personal experience, very young kids have no difficulty absorbing up to 3 languages before they go to school. It is just important that they speak a certain language with a given person or use a particular language in a certain place or environment. For example, Gaeilge or Irish with the Ahar or with the father, or Slovenian with the mother, for like we do at home here, and English at the creche or the kindergarten, or say with the grandparents. Owen ta anjob jainta agat, then aglev sha. So Gearóid says, you've done a great job with the interviews with this podcast. Gearóid Gramila Mahagut, thank you very much for your ongoing input to Bite Size Irish Gaelic. I love hearing from you, and I have to say, here's a call out for iTunes reviews, because here are countries where there are no iTunes reviews yet. And wait a second, we have listeners in Ireland, in the UK, Riecht Eantaha, the UK, Germany, and Yaramain, in Switzerland, and Elevish, and even over in China, or Anchin. So calling out to you people listening in those countries, why not log on to iTunes, go to the iTunes store, find the Bite Size Irish Gaelic podcast, and you'll be able to write a 5-star review. So thanks for that. Alright, I do want to start by saying a Happy New Year because I'm recording this at the beginning of 2014, and that's the year in Irish is Chávila is a ceathair déag. So ceathair déag is 14, Chávila means 2000, so we put it all together. Chávila 2000 is, which means and, a ceathair déag 14. Chávila is a ceathair déag. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but I just wanted to wish you a Happy New Year. As we say in Irish Gaelic, we say Ahvlian fi washachet. So the beginning of a new year is always a good chance to put things into perspective, right? So if you've been interested in learning a bit of Irish, or for example in visiting Ireland in the coming year, in 2014, now's a good time to reflect and think, well, where do you want to be? If you're learning a bit of Irish, where do you want to be in 6 months' time, for example, if you're visiting Ireland? Or if you've been promising yourself to visit Ireland, maybe now's the time to start looking into that trip if you're going to do it this year. Now, I'm not talking about massive goals either. It needs to be something realistic. But for example, if you've learned a couple of words in Irish before, now's the chance to set yourself a little goal and say, well, how about I push myself and prepare myself to have some little conversations in Irish. So you can practice some of that on your own. You can supplement that later on with speaking with a native speaker or a tutor or a teacher that you could find. But now's the chance to plan it out and say, well, I've got a bit of time. I could take 10 minutes 3 times a week, and that's a small commitment, and just review what I want to learn and push myself a little bit. And in 6 months' time, review where you got during the Irish summer. And so this year, 2014, for all Bite Size Irish Gaelic members, and you don't have to be a member, wherever you are, wherever you're listening to us, I want to encourage you to learn to speak a couple of more words or sentences or even grammatical structures compared to what you've already done, even if you're a just fresh beginner. So jump into it. If you are setting yourself some goals in relation to the Irish language or just visiting Ireland in 2014, why don't you come to the podcast show notes, bitesizeirishgaelic.com/podcast, and find episode 11 and post your comment under the show notes. Right, as an update about how Ireland's been doing lately, in December 2013, we had a rough bit of weather, so I wanted to talk a bit about that. Just at the beginning of 2014 also, we saw some stormy weather, some strong winds, heavy rains. So as I record, only about 2 or 3 days ago, for example, the sea resort town called Lahinch. It's in County Clare in the west of Ireland, so it's pointing out into the Atlantic, and surfers love that spot. But a couple of days ago, the sea breached basically the car park wall of that town. It flooded all of the front car parks that face out onto the sea, and the sea came up against some buildings that are in the town. So usually they're used to some high tides in Lahinch, but when that roaring Atlantic wind is pushing the sea into the town, well, I'd be worried for the safety of people who were just along the coastline at that time. Another town in County Limerick was Foynes, and they have a very deep harbour there. So ships come along from the Atlantic and enter the Shannon estuary, and they dock up at Foynes. And Foynes village, I heard that some of the houses there have been built for at least 150 years. And they said that they had not seen this type of flooding before. So they recorded the highest ever recorded high tide at Foynes. And what happened? The sea basically broke a seawall, like a protective wall, and seeped through more walls. From what I understand, from what I heard on the radio, the sea literally pushed up against the wall and seeped through the cracks of the wall and pushed out into the town, and it flooded the main street. There was a 97-year-old woman who had to be evacuated from her home. It was a home that she's lived in all her life. And there's a community centre that was just surrounded by water. So other places such as Donegal Town and Ballina and Castlebar in County Mayo, they've been having a rough time with flooding as well. Another example, Sasha, my wife, she was driving from Limerick City, where we live, over to Shannon, which is in County Clare. So it's about a 20-mile drive at most. But only a couple of miles from our home, she passed a road which was blocked by flooding, and she saw a car that was stuck in that road flooding. The River Shannon had basically pushed up against the road there, and someone going to work got stuck and couldn't get their car out. Now, from what I know, nobody died in this incident at all. But there's more stormy weather coming in tonight and the next day, and all these Atlantic weather fronts are just pounding us. They seem to come from North America, across Greenland, straight across the Atlantic, and they are hitting Ireland this winter. So we're having some really tough weather. But just about everybody's doing okay, they're safe, and here's hoping that everybody keeps safe, and we hope that there's not too much more damage to businesses and homes and roads and people put out of their normal day, their normal routines as they go about business. Dublin as well saw some very high water, so we're hoping that there's no more real bad damage this winter. Alright, so on to a question. A couple of months ago we got an email from Janet Scoble, and she says, Díreacht, hello. Owen, I read somewhere, to quote, many native Irish speakers are disinclined to speak Irish in front of or with outsiders. It is important that visitors keep this in mind and persevere in their efforts to engage people in Irish conversation. So Janet asked me, what are your thoughts about this? Do you find this to be fact, and why? And Gurv Mahagut, that's Janet Scoble in Pennsylvania. Excellent question, Janet. We've covered some of this in past Bite-Size Irish Gaelic podcast episodes, so it's worth listening back to some of my opinions on this. But basically, yes, the answer is you need to persevere. By default, when you visit Ireland, people will speak English to you. There is no second guessing this. It is going to happen. So that means that when you come to visit Ireland, you need to be first prepared to use a couple of words of Irish and to put smiles on people's faces when they realise that, wait a second. For example, that American tourist has just said Díreacht or Conasatatu to me. So there's a couple of different settings, so I break it down a bit. So in a normal English language setting in Ireland, that's the default setting. If you arrive in Dublin Airport and you fly in and there's the security guard there, or the taxi drivers are there, or you get to your hotel, you'll hear pretty much English all around you. You would be very lucky to just hear Irish randomly. I rarely do so. Sometimes I hear it on the bus. Sometimes I'll hear young people speak it depending where they're travelling to or something. But really, by default, a very large percentage of stuff you hear in Ireland will be English. Now, there are other settings, right? So you can make a point of visiting the Gaeltacht. And basically the Gaeltacht areas are those areas which have been designated basically as important because historically at least, the main community language in those areas is Irish Gaelic. Now it has to be said, even if you go as far as the Gaeltacht, you probably will hear Irish. That's the first thing. But you still have to persevere. So, and Janet asks, why would someone speak English to me? So let's just say, for example, if you've been a listener to this podcast, I gave this example before. So we were in the thick of the Gaeltacht, real rural County Kerry Gaeltacht, right? And people were coming out of Mass on Sunday morning and you could hear it was the Irish language all around. It was definitely the community language. And we were staying in a local B&B with some Irish speakers and we were going to the shop in the village, which was right next to the church. So I go into the shop and I wasn't really prepared because I wasn't really thinking, and the person who served me in the shop spoke English to me. So I didn't look like especially a tourist or anything, but obviously they knew that I was not from that village. So by default, they're not going to deal with pretty much, they would probably see it as the hassle. Oh, I'm going to try to speak Irish to everybody who comes into my shop when all they want is a loaf of bread, and I'm going to put them off by pushing some Irish on them. That's a very possible thought of the shopkeeper. Now, in any case, if there's shopkeepers in the Gaeltacht, I would encourage them for sure to use some Irish on people and to be proactive about it. So if you see the person isn't comfortable about it, then just play along and switch to English. But anyway, it is a shame that you have to, by default, push. Push is a bad word because I don't want it to be negative, but you just have to go prepared, and all you need is a couple of words or phrases. So just for example, again, we were visiting Untitled. In English that's known as Carrow, and that's in Connemara, County Galway. And I went into the pub. I was on my own at the time that evening. I went in, the bar lady served me in English, and I was spending my first night there and I was pretty, not depressed, but upset that I expected Irish to be all around me. But then I started hearing the old men who were just beside me at the bar, and they were using full rich Irish language. So the next time I ordered a Guinness, it was in Irish and it was no problem. I just said something like, Pionta Guinness le hull, or something to that effect. Another story from the same town, Ancararua. I found it very interesting at the time. I went into this village kind of hip cafe. It seems to be like a pizzeria as well. And guess what? A comedian Des Bishop was there learning Irish at the time. He just happened to be in there getting a lesson. A few years ago, he spent what seems to be about a year in Connemara. He was learning Irish. He grew up in New York without Irish, but of an Irish background. So he really pushed to learn some Irish. And if you look on YouTube, you'll find some great clips of him talking about his experience learning Irish. But in the same cafe, the same day I sat down, and there were 3 women in one of the tables next to me. I found it really interesting because there was a full conversation happening between all 3 women, right? But the thing was, 2 of them were speaking Irish. The 3rd woman was speaking English, and it stuck at that. So 2 of the women were giving all their feedback and opinions and chatting away in Irish, and the 3rd woman was chatting away in English. Now, they were all participating in the same conversation. So I found that pretty interesting. I'm guessing all 3 of them were brought up with Irish, being from that area and having Irish like that. I wonder why that third woman was speaking English. That's up to her, no judgment, but I was just curious at the time. That was interesting. And I mentioned before another time we were on the Aran Islands in Inisheer. So they're out in the Atlantic, just after County Clare and County Galway coasts. And we get off the little ferry. There was no vehicles on the ferry, it's just pedestrians, people walking. So we get off the ferry and walk up, and there's some middle-aged men, and they've got horse and cart. So the offer is that they'll bring you by horse and cart around the island. It's a pretty small island. The thing was, I heard them speak Irish between them, and they were just kind of muttering between them. But when us kind of tourists walked up, the Irish just disappeared. They stopped speaking Irish and they switched to English. So they were like, giving us the offer. It was like, yeah, have a horse ride, €25. Do you want to come here? We've got a great horse ride. It'll take 2 hours. And they were describing it like that. So they were not going to use Irish on tourists who were not probably going to understand them in the first place. That's debatable because a lot of Irish people visit. But still, by default, they were speaking English. Now, I did get an email in the past few days from a man called Robert Todd. And he's allowed me to use some of his quotes on our website. So I'm taking the privilege to read out a bit more of his email than we've originally spoke about. So Robert, thanks for sharing this. And this is a really interesting experience. Robert said, "We just returned to the States after a little over 2 weeks in Dublin, the Brunaboyne area, which I believe is County Kildare, and then the Dingle Peninsula, which is down in County Kerry, sticking out into the Atlantic coast. We were in a little seaside cottage near the village of Clachan and Brandon Bay when the big storm blew in. And I think I downloaded your cheat sheets between power outages. So the big storm he's referring to is one I think that blew in around just after Christmas Day. And the cheat sheets he's referring to are our popular pronunciation cheat sheets for Irish. So Robert goes on, "We headed to Dingle for a number of reasons, among them taking in the extraordinary natural beauty, experiencing the Ransday festivities on Lá Éile Stifoin. So on the 26th of December, there's a very special local tradition of marching in the streets in Dingle town, in Andangan, and you should check it out if you can. And Robert visited many historic sites. Mostly, however, we wanted to experience a small slice of life in a Gaeltacht region, and I'm partial to the Munster dialect, or the accent, he says. I'm happy to say I was able to get in some Irish practice with the very welcoming folks on the peninsula in Dingle. And for that matter, even in Killarney and Dublin, I found taxi drivers, shop owners and waiters willing to chat with me. Needless to say, Bite-Size Irish Gaelic has been a tremendous help." Now, guys, are you listening? This is amazing. Robert made the decision to visit Ireland. He passed through some of the most touristy places. First of all, Dublin City, and then Killarney, which is a beautiful spot, very popular with tourists, and the town is well accommodated to those tourists, right? And then they headed out towards the Dingle Peninsula, where I would hope you would hear Irish. Even in Dingle town, if you go to, for example, O'Flaherty's pub and say "Dírit" to the barman, he's going to throw back some Irish at you, so give it a go. But Robert, this is great hearing this. What Robert is basically telling us is that he plucked up the courage to speak with, for example, taxi drivers and shop owners in Dublin and Killarney. And those people, it sounds like, were able to help him, or they were happy to speak along with him, or use the little words of Irish that they do have. So this is a fabulous example. I mean, if you're in Dublin and you're sitting in a taxi and that you're having a pretty hard time understanding the taxi driver's accent in his local Dublin accent, wow, just to make the step and to try to use some Irish with that taxi driver and to see what happens. You're going to get a smile on their face. Maybe they will say that they don't understand. They'll probably say that, use a couple of words and then say that they wish they learned more when they were younger. I hear that a lot in Ireland. And if you're lucky, they might be able to speak more with you. Or if you don't have more Irish, that doesn't matter. You've used a couple of expressions and then you can switch to English if you want and explain to them why you're interested in learning or speaking a bit of Irish. So Janet or Jeanette, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. I'll go with Jeanette, you can correct me. So thanks for sending in the question. And Robert, thanks for sending in your story. And just to say, if you want to come to bitesizeirishgaelic.com, if you're listening to this, and you can prepare yourself for learning some simple conversations. So for example, we've got lessons, online lessons of how to start a simple conversation and how to reply to the most likely things that somebody will say to you, or just some simple words and phrases that will help you out along the way. So if you want, come by at Bite Size Irish Gaelic. We've got a free trial. There's no pressure. If you're a member, great. Come back and check back on those lessons. If not, it's a free trial, like I say. I mean, you just come to our website and give the lessons a go. There are audio recordings there that I've done. And so when you're viewing a lesson on our site, when you've clicked into that lesson, you can click the audio button and listen to the phrase as many times as you want. And then we've given you some phonetic pronunciation guides as well to go with those recordings, because that will help you, it will help your brain understand some of the sounds that you're hearing. Alright, on to another question that we got in from Michaela Sullivan. Michaela says, I have a question for you. Do people in Ireland actually say top of the morning to you? I would like to know, because some people have argued with me and I just wanted to know if I was right in saying that they don't say that. I was under the assumption that Americans came up with that. But anyway, if you would answer my question, I would be very grateful. Thank you. I like the question, Michaela. And pretty much the simple answer is no. We don't say top of the morning to you. You'll probably come across an Irish person in the morning and you go, well, that's the word, W-E-L-L, well, just to say, hey, how are you? Or you could say, hey, how's it going? Or good morning, or whatever works for you. But no, we don't say top of the morning. And it's an interesting question, because did it come out from America? Or I wonder if it has roots in an old phrase in the Irish language that immigrants may have brought along with them, for example, to the United States, and that phrase got picked up in English and they kind of ran with it. So I'm not sure. So if anybody has a bit of feedback on this question, where top of the morning to you, that phrase comes from, do let us know. Come to bitesizeirishgaelic.com/podcast. Click on to episode 11 and you can leave a reply under the show notes. We got a question in from Shelby who says, how do you say yes or no in Irish? Regards, Shelby. Well, Shelby, it seems like an easy question, right? That's all Shelby said. How do you say yes or no in Irish? The answer is not so easy. I'm really sorry to say. This is just one of those fun facts in Irish, that there is no direct, and I say direct, word for yes or no in the Irish language. There is no yes or no. Now, it depends on context. Obviously, there's ways to convey the meaning of yes or no. So let's start with an example, right? If you ask a person in Irish, and I'll translate into English. So if you ask, are you going into town? Like, are you driving into town? They might say, I am. Or they might say, I'm not. Did you hear that? Where I didn't use yes or no. So what we do is basically reply with a bit of the question back at them. Now, I don't want to get into grammatical points here, because, you know, there's a time and a place for grammar, and it's not always suitable. So what we basically do is use the positive form or the negative form of the verb that was used in the question. So there are words like tá, which basically means yes, but it's used in certain contexts, and it depends on if you were asked a question with that same verb, that to be verb. Or you could answer with the word níl, which means no in a kind of way. You could say, are you going into town? Tá me. That means I am. Or you could say níl me, which means I'm not. So that's how we answer a question in Irish. And we have plenty more ways. If you want to dive into some of the kind of intricacies of that, of how to pose your own questions in Irish and how to answer them, come to Bite Size Irish Gaelic and try out the lessons. But anyway, enough of that. So Shelby, thanks a lot for your question. And what I'll do in the show notes is post a link to a previous blog post we have about asking a question in Irish. And the last listener question or email we got in at Bite Size Irish Gaelic was from Noreen O'Driscoll. So Noreen says, I liked the idea of going for a course in Ireland in a few months, so wondered what the best ones are. Yours, of course, she says. Do those types of courses. So Noreen, excellent question, and it's really nice just to hear that you're planning to visit Ireland and at the same time you're planning to push a bit on learning the Irish language, our native, beautiful, if I may say so myself, beautiful native language that we have in Ireland. Like I said before, the language encapsulates so much of the Gael culture, that Celtic culture in Ireland. When you hear the language, the ways that the language itself expresses itself gives you an insight into how Irish people have basically formed their thoughts over several millennia. That's a tough word. I should say just several thousand years, right? So to answer Noreen's question about us at Bite Size Irish Gaelic, no, we don't do in-person events. We're working on Bite Size Irish Gaelic Live with tutors where you can learn online. So I'll put a link into the show notes for that. And we run online courses that you can take in your own time. But no, if you're visiting Ireland, my best recommendation for you is to visit Idis Gael. Now, I won't spell that out here, but I'll put a link in the show notes. The place is run by Liam O'Quinnagoin, and it's up in Donegal. So what they basically do is run 1 week and 2 week courses to the best of my knowledge, and they've got a bit of a mix. There's a cultural focus on some courses they have. There's more of a language focus in others, but the most known, I would say, in-person kind of once-off events for visiting. So if you're in Ireland, what you do is you would book ahead with them. You'd book your place on the course and you would arrange accommodation with them. What they basically have are Irish lessons during the day, and then there's probably some excursions in the afternoon or evening. There'd be ceilidh dances. You'd be sure to meet a lot of different people as well who visit there. You get a really interesting mix of people who've invested the time in attending those Irish courses, Irish language courses. So even if you're a real beginner, they can cater for you. So I do suggest that you do get in contact with them and say that we sent you. I'd also point you back to our episode 9 of the Bite Size Irish Gaelic podcast, where I spoke to the principal teacher, Matt Wallen, and he's an American who moved to Ireland. He was an elementary school teacher. He realised that if he wanted to teach in a school in Ireland, he would have to learn Irish because he'd have to teach the kids the Irish language. So guess what? He went and learned the Irish language. But during that episode, he gave his own suggestions about finding local schools before you travel. So in essence, what he said was to, before you visit Ireland, to do an internet search and just find a local Irish language course, maybe one that's maybe for a week or two. Maybe pick your spot first, do a search in Dingle or in County Kerry or, for example, County Galway, and see what pops up, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed. I'm also going to link you off to Audrey's blog post, where she posted first before her experience of visiting Idis Gael. So you get a bit of a background, how it's run, and there's photos there, and it's well worth the read. So Noreen, thanks a lot for your question. Alright, so that's it for today's podcast. And you can send me your listener questions, so I'd really appreciate if you email me your questions at podcast@bitesizeirishgaelic.com. bitesizeirishgaelic.com. And whatever, you might have a question about Ireland, or maybe around the Irish language that's been niggling you, or you wanted to find out before you visit. If that's the case, send me an email. I'll email you straight back. But we can also then cover your question on the podcast, and you'll be featured on the podcast. If you have, say, a comment about this specific episode, you can just leave your comment on the Bite Size Irish Gaelic podcast show notes. So that's again bitesizeirishgaelic.com/podcast, and just click on to episode 11, where you can leave a reply straight under the page. Now, like I said, the best thing you can do is to leave an iTunes review. So if you've really enjoyed this episode, why don't you, just when it switches off, log on to iTunes, open up iTunes, be sure that you're logged in with your iTunes account, then find the Bite Size Irish Gaelic podcast page, and leave a written review for the podcast, because it's really the best way for us to say to others who are thinking about subscribing to the podcast. It's a great way to show them, hey, this is actually something that's fun to listen to, if that's your own opinion, or that it's worth a listen. And we want to reach out to more listeners. So the best thing you can do is post that review on iTunes. 5 stars, thank you. So, thanks to Tukumo for their music, which you hear on this episode under a Creative Commons license. And until the next episode, Slán go fóill, bye for now.